Spoiled heiress shames working girl, but the man she didn't notice changed everything. It was one of those crisp mornings in San Miguel de Allende where the sun came up lazy, stretching gold across the cobblestone streets like honey being poured slowly from a jar. Tourists had just started to trickle out from boutique hotels, clicking their phone cameras at the faded pink cathedral, the little kids already running barefoot through the fountain square. But in the alley just behind Mercado de San Juan, a different kind of morning was beginning for a girl named Sofia. She walked with her head down, her hands raw and red from scrubbing kitchen tiles the night before. The plastic bucket in her left hand was cracked on the side, and the mop she carried on her right shoulder still smelled faintly of bleach. Her shoes were two mismatched sneakers, one white, one navy, both too small for her feet. But she walked with quiet determination, her long black braids swinging behind her like a ribbon of pride she refused to cut off. Sofia was 19. She never said much, but if you looked closely, you'd see the kind of eyes that knew how to survive long before they learned how to dream. She didn't have a family anymore. Her mother had passed from a lung infection the year before, and her little brother had been taken in by a family 2 towns over. All Sofia had was her job cleaning ghost houses and a worn canvas bag with a single book inside, Little Women, in Spanish. She read it every night before sleep, not because she believed life was like a storybook, but because it helped her remember that girls like her still had stories worth telling. As she turned onto Calle Hidalgo, the street already bustled with early activity. A florist laid out bright marigolds on a cloth-covered table. An old man played his guitar near the taco stand, the kind of sad song that made dogs pause mid-trot. But Sofia didn't stop. Her destination was a private villa just a few blocks away, owned by one of the wealthiest families in the region. People who spoke English more often than Spanish and who always left their dishes in the sink like it was someone else's job to care. She didn't complain. Not once. Not even when they shouted. Not even when they called her the help, like it was her name. Sofia believed in doing her work quietly and leaving with her dignity intact. But dignity is a fragile thing. Just as she passed by the old bakery, where the smell of sweet conscience spilled into the street, something cold and foul splashed across her legs. Her mop and bucket clattered to the ground. For a moment, she didn't even process what had happened. Then she looked down, mud, dirty water, all over her faded skirt, all over her hands, even splattered across her face. The bucket had tipped sideways, the remaining mop water now soaking into her socks. She turned slowly to a white Range Rover idled just behind her, spotless, the chrome grille gleaming in the morning sun. Behind the tinted window, she saw a shadow move, and then the glass slid down with a soft electronic whir. Out leaned a woman. Tall, flawless skin, sunglasses resting on her head like a crown. Even her lipstick was perfect, a deep wine red that looked expensive. Her name was Clarissa Reyes, married to a venture capitalist, daughter of a senator, queen bee of every charity gala within 200 miles. Clarissa didn't apologize. She didn't ask if Sofia was all right. She laughed, a sharp, deliberate laugh, like a glass breaking on tile. "Oh God," Clarissa said in crisp English, glancing at her friend in the passenger seat. "I didn't even see her. Why is she mopping the street like a beggar? That's what we pay sanitation for, isn't it?" The friend laughed too. "Maybe she's hoping someone will toss her coins." Clarissa leaned further out of the window. Her eyes scanned Sofia from head to toe. "Sweetie," she said slowly, her tone thick with mock kindness. "Next time, try not to block traffic with your little chores. You're not invisible, you know." And just like that, the window hummed back up. The car pulled forward. The tires missed the bucket by inches. Mud water still dripping from her skirt. Sofia stood frozen on the cobblestones. People had turned to look. Some crossed the street. Others whispered. But one person didn't look away that he'd been watching since before the splash. A man. Older. Tall. In a worn gray suit and polished leather shoes. He stood near the taco stand, arms crossed, unreadable behind his dark glasses. And though no one else knew it, Sofia certainly didn't. His last name carried more weight in this city than Clarissa's entire lineage. His name was Alejandro Cortez. And what Sofia didn't know, what Clarissa would soon regret not knowing, is that Alejandro Cortez wasn't just watching. He was remembering. Because he had seen eyes like Sofia's once before. A long time ago. in a girl who had once been forced to clean offices with her bare hands. A girl who taught him the value of respect before he ever owned a suit. Alejandro didn't speak that morning. Not yet. He simply pulled out his phone, snapped a picture of the Range Rover, and then he walked away, calm and slow. Sophia picked up her mop. Her face was blank, unreadable, but something inside her had shifted. That day, something cracked open, not from pain, but from the silent understanding that the world could be ugly even when you tried to be good. And sometimes, you needed more than quiet strength. You needed someone to see, someone did, and by the end of the week, everything in Clarissa Reyes's world, her reputation, her influence, even her place in that spotless gated villa, would be shaken to its core. But for now, the only sound in the street was the rustle of marigolds in the breeze, and the last few notes of the old man's guitar. And Sophia, covered in mud but still holding her head high, walked forward without looking back. It didn't take long for the moment to pass into memory, but not for Sophia. For her, that morning stuck like grit behind the eyes, like a burn that doesn't show up on the skin but keeps aching anyway. The laughter, the way the woman said "sweetie," the indifference of the passing crowd. She didn't cry, not even when she reached the villa and one of the staff turned her away from the front entrance because of the stains on her skirt. Not even when she had to rinse herself in the back garden hose before scrubbing toilets that gleamed more than the faces that used them. She just scrubbed harder. The mop left streaks on the tiles. Her hands, already sore, bled slightly along the knuckles, but she didn't stop. Because somewhere deep inside, somewhere she rarely let herself touch, was a memory of her mother's voice. Mija, you work with dignity. Even if no one sees it, God does. And if you fall, don't cry. Stand taller than the fall. By noon, the city had moved on. The plaza hummed with the drone of tourists. Children played hopscotch across fading chalk lines, and Clarissa Reyes sat at a rooftop cafe, sipping imported iced tea. She wore a lavender blouse and large pearl earrings that swayed with every dramatic tilt of her head. She talked loudly, the kind of loud that demanded attention, as if volume were its own kind of power. Her friend, a blonde woman named Kate, kept checking her phone. Clarissa, she said, I think someone was filming earlier, when we were in the car. Clarissa rolled her eyes. So? What? They're gonna what? Post it online and cancel me for splashing a maid. That's the most attention she'll ever get. Kate bit her lip. Still, you know how people are. They twist everything. Clarissa waved her off. Oh please. I'm on the board of the Centro Cultural. I hosted UNICEF last month. No one's gonna care about a bucket girl. Let's just move on. I have a fitting at 3. But Alejandro Cortez hadn't moved on. While Clarissa planned brunches and fittings, Alejandro sat in a small office tucked between an art gallery and a leather shop near the edge of the old district. The walls were lined with dusty books and old photographs. Him at 26 in front of a community center, him shaking hands with the governor, him beside the woman who raised him. That morning, he'd stared at the photo of that woman longer than usual. Her name had been Teresa Morales, and she'd once cleaned 8 houses a week to feed Alejandro and his siblings after their father disappeared. She was the kind of woman who walked through storms with a shawl and a smile. She never asked for thanks. She asked for fairness. Alejandro had built a quiet empire, not flashy, not loud. He owned real estate, held shares in 4 local businesses, and sat silently on advisory boards for education and development. He had enough money to buy his own reputation twice. But what mattered to him wasn't money. It was memory, legacy. He had sworn that when he reached the top, he'd never forget the ground. That's why the photo of Clarissa's car, the video clip he found minutes later on social media, and the look on Sophia's face didn't sit right with him. Not just because it was cruel, but because it was familiar. Because power, misused, always looked the same. By the next morning, the video had gone from a quiet upload to a small storm. It hadn't gone viral yet, but the local forums picked it up and whispers began. Not enough to affect Clarissa yet, but enough to form clouds. Sophia had no idea. She didn't use social media. Her world was mop buckets and leftovers, and the book she reread in secret. But she noticed something. The next day, when she walked past the flower stand, the vendor didn't look through her. He offered her a flower. The old man with the guitar nodded as she passed, and the security guard at the market, who usually watched her like she might steal soap, opened the door for her this time. It felt strange, unearned. Unsteady when she reached the villa that afternoon, things felt colder. The head maid, Mariana, glanced at her with uncertainty. "You should stay out of sight today," she muttered. "Madame Reyes is in a mood," Sophia nodded. She always stayed out of sight anyway. But that wasn't enough this time. Sophia scrubbed the lower veranda. Clarissa's voice rang out behind her, loud enough for everyone to hear. "So this is the girl who wants to be famous?" Sophia froze. "I saw the video." Clarissa continued, heels clicking closer. "You think you're smart? You think people are going to care about you? That you can humiliate me and get away with it?" Sophia stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly from the cold water. "I didn't film it," she said softly. "But you didn't stop it either," Clarissa snapped. "You could have said something. Deleted it. You think you're so clever, don't you?" Sophia didn't speak. Not because she couldn't, but because she knew it wouldn't matter. The woman in front of her wasn't interested in truth, only in control. Clarissa stepped closer. "Listen carefully. If I hear one more thing about this, you'll never work again. Not here. Not anywhere decent in this city." She turned sharply, her perfume trailing behind her like smoke. Sophia lowered her eyes and picked up the mop again. Her fingers were shaking now, not from fear, but from the fury she didn't know how to name. That night, as the city lights flickered on and church bells rang in the dusk, Alejandro made a call. "That I want her story," he told the woman on the other end of the line. "Not just what happened. I want her life. Where she came from. What she does. I want to understand what people like Clarissa forget." The voice on the other line, Lucia, a young journalist Alejandro had mentored, was quiet for a beat. "Then, you think it'll matter?" Alejandro's voice was calm. "It always matters. If we tell it right." Lucia met Sophia the next day. Not at her work, but at the library, one of the only places Sophia visited regularly that wasn't tied to scrubbing or sweeping. Sophia was wary. She didn't trust people easily, especially people with notebooks. But Lucia didn't start with questions. She started with a thermos of hot chocolate. "I heard you like books," she said. "Me too," they talked. At first about stories, then about her mother, then about the accident, the hospital bills, the job Sophia took, the places she slept, the brother she couldn't visit, the villa, the woman in the car. Lucia wrote none of it down at first. She just listened. But as Sophia spoke, something began to change. Her voice, once cautious, grew steadier. Her eyes, once downcast, began to meet Lucia's gaze. She didn't ask for pity. She didn't want revenge. She only wanted to be seen. And soon, Lucia saw everything. When the article came out a week later, it didn't scream. It didn't attack. It told a quiet story about a girl with tired hands and strong eyes who had dignity stolen and still chose not to bow. Clarissa didn't read it at first. She was too busy with lawyers and PR consultants, trying to remove the video from platforms. But by then, it had already spread. People weren't just watching anymore. They were talking, and Alejandro? He was just getting started. He sent an invitation to Sophia. No titles. No fanfare. Just a note. "I'd like to meet you." No obligations. Just tea and conversation. "I think we have something in common." Sophia almost didn't go. But the way the note was written, simple, respectful, it felt different. So she went. What she didn't expect was to find herself sitting in a quiet rooftop garden, being poured jasmine tea by a man who wore his kindness like it was stitched into his collar. He asked about her dreams. No one had ever done that before. And when she hesitated, he said, "You don't have to answer today. Sometimes the question is enough." The world was starting to tilt. The woman who once laughed from her SUV now stood at the edge of scandal. The girl she'd splashed now had a name, a voice, a face that people remembered. But this wasn't about vengeance. This was about restoration. And as the city began to choose sides, one question loomed silently behind every headline, every whisper, every conversation. What does it cost to humiliate someone who has nothing? And what happens when someone with everything decides to care? The answer was still coming. And Clarissa, for all her power, was no longer the only one being watched. The morning it happened, the sky was quiet, deceptively soft with pale blue lights stretching across the colonial rooftops, giving no hint of the storm to come. Clarissa Reyes stood in her dressing room before a grand mirror framed in gold, dabbing rosewater on her cheekbones with the same precision she used for her press statements. Her outfit was immaculate: cream silk blouse, high-waisted slate skirt, and diamond studs that sparkled like ice when she turned her head. Her husband was already gone, off to Europe under the guise of business, but really escaping the rising smoke around her name. Clarissa's fingers danced across her phone screen as she skimmed yet another headline. Sophia's story reaches 3 million views. Her lips twisted into something like a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. That afternoon, she would appear at the Cultural Preservation Summit, an event packed with cameras, politicians, and donors, most of whom still owed her favors. Her PR team had begged her to stay home, to wait it out, but she refused. "They expect me to crumble," she said as she clipped on her pearls. "But I'm not made of glass." As she entered the grand neoclassical hall, sunlight poured through stained glass, spilling colors onto polished marble floors, and the crowd of high society murmured with the rustle of silk and suspicion. She walked through them like royalty, chin high, heels sharp, smile staged. Cameras blinked. Reporters leaned in. She took the podium with grace, the heavy wood and carved emblems behind her echoing a presence she didn't deserve. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice even and warm. "It's an honor to be here among people who, like me, believe in culture, dignity, and the preservation of what makes our communities strong." She paused for effect, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Recently, my name has been caught in a moment of controversy. A video, taken without my knowledge, has caused pain. And while I cannot undo the past, I can say this: I am learning. I am growing. And I stand before you, humbled, changed, and committed to being better." She was just getting into her rhythm when the giant projection screen behind her flickered, once, then again, and suddenly the curated slideshow of her philanthropic efforts was replaced. The image that appeared was simple: a young woman in a blue apron, wiping mud from her face, standing beside a shattered mop bucket. Murmurs began to rise. Clarissa's eyes narrowed. This is not, but the screen had already shifted. Another photo, this time of Sophia walking home in the rain with a soaked backpack. Then a short video played. The original one. Clarissa's voice, unmistakable, mocking. "Sweetie, maybe don't block traffic with your little chores." Laughter. Her friend's voice. "Maybe she's hoping someone will toss her coins." Clarissa's face went pale. Her grip on the podium tightened. The audience was still, the silence thick as stone. Then a new voice came from the speakers, softer, not filmed, but recorded in interview. "Sophia's. I never wanted attention. I just wanted to be treated like I mattered. Like I existed." The clip continued, a montage of Sophia's days, cleaning kitchens, reading alone, standing beside a hospital bed, all set to the quiet weight of her words. When people laugh at you and still expect you to smile, it makes you wonder if they ever saw you as human to begin with. When the screen went black again, Clarissa was frozen. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She searched the room for a friendly face. There were none. Even her closest allies sat stone-faced, unwilling to meet her eyes. And standing in the far corner, his arms calmly crossed, was Alejandro Cortez. He said nothing. He only watched. Clarissa turned sharply, leaving the podium in silence. Her heels struck the floor like echoes of power slipping away. The next day, the media didn't care about the speech she'd planned. They only wrote about the one she didn't give. Headlines swarmed like bees, from ashes to honor. The girl who wasn't supposed to speak. Clarissa walks out in shame, and Cortez backs viral Maid story. Sophia, meanwhile, stayed quiet. She didn't gloat. She didn't pose. She went back to work, but not for Clarissa, who had fled the city under pressure, her sponsors withdrawn, her name becoming the warning on every tongue. The villa was sold, and when Sophia walked past it weeks later, the gate no longer glinted with polished brass but hung open for construction. It had been bought by Alejandro Cortez and donated to a youth arts program, where voices like Sophia's would be nurtured, not mocked. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Sophia stood to the side, dressed simply, her hands tucked together. When the mayor offered her the scissors, she paused, uncertain, then accepted them, cutting through the red ribbon not with pride, but with quiet certainty. The cameras flashed. The applause swelled. And in that single moment, the girl who had been splashed, silenced, and overlooked became more than a symbol. She became a beginning. A reminder that stories matter. That dignity stolen can still be reclaimed. and that the loudest voice in the room is not always the one with a microphone. Sometimes, it's the one that refuses to disappear. The fallout didn't come with sirens. It didn't crash through the city with headlines and hashtags the way some scandals do. It seeped, quiet and steady, like water beneath a door, like truth too long ignored finding the cracks it needed. After the summit, Clarissa disappeared. Not from the earth, of course. People like her never vanish entirely, but from the rooms that once belonged to her. Invitations dried up. Brands pulled back. Even the editor of the regional lifestyle magazine, once her weekend lunch date, quietly canceled their feature and issued a statement about holding all contributors to standards of inclusion and human respect. Her husband, Martin, returned from London with a lawyer. The divorce was fast, almost mechanical. They split assets behind closed doors while his spokesperson told the press. Mr. Reyes had no prior knowledge of the incident and regrets any unintentional distress it may have caused. Clarissa didn't comment. The public didn't wait. She became a cautionary tale on late-night talk shows, a whispered name in country clubs, a meme captioned with the words, "Sweetie, you're canceled." But consequences alone don't make a story worth remembering. What made it matter, what gave it weight, was what Alejandro did next. He never chased the cameras, never called a press conference. He worked, like always, in the background. But this time, his background included Sofia. It started with a letter, handwritten, folded neatly, delivered by courier to the apartment she shared with 3 other girls near the edge of the district. No logos, no signature on the envelope, just her name. Inside, one sentence. "I would be honored if you'd consider joining the board of a new project, one built on dignity, not charity." She didn't answer right away. Her instinct, born from years of distrust and false hope, told her to walk away. But something about Alejandro, his silence at the summit, his steadiness, felt different. Not transactional, not performative, just real. So she met him. In a sunlit room above a cafe with no name, surrounded by blueprints and legal documents and hand-drawn sketches of a community space unlike any in the city. A center for vocational training, literacy, childcare. Built for women like her. By women like her. He didn't offer her a token seat. He offered her a voice. And she took it. The first meetings were awkward. She didn't know the language of grants or bylaws or city permits. But she knew what the floor should feel like beneath a mother's tired feet. She knew what safety sounded like in a child's laugh. And over time, they listened to her more than anyone else. Clarissa, meanwhile, tried to reclaim her narrative. She posted a long captioned photo of herself at a beach cleanup, smiling in borrowed humility. But the comments weren't kind. People don't forget cruelty wrapped in pearls. She made appearances at events where she wasn't welcome and eventually stopped getting invited. The villa, once guarded by wrought iron gates and garden parties, was reimagined under Sofia's input. The old dining hall became a workshop space. The wine cellar was transformed into a reading room with secondhand shelves and cushions sewn by volunteers. And on the 3rd floor, where Clarissa had once shouted at maids for folding towels incorrectly, they built a dormitory for women escaping domestic violence. When it opened, no ribbon was cut. Just a simple sign, mounted near the stairs. It read, "This space is for the unseen, the unheard, the undefeated." Sofia didn't give a speech. She stood near the doorway, watching 2 kids chase each other across the tiled floor, their laughter echoing off walls that used to hold silence. Lucia, the journalist, smiled beside her. "You should be proud," she said. Sofia shrugged. "I'm still tired." They both laughed. Alejandro arrived a few minutes later, his suit dusty from the construction site across town where a new health clinic was being built. "They're calling it La Casa Nueva," he said, nodding to the center. "Fitting, don't you think?" Sofia looked around, at the light filtering through the stained windows, at the mothers unpacking lunchboxes near the window ledge, at the boy reading out loud to a little girl who clapped at every word, and said simply, "Yeah, I think it is." The media stopped chasing the story after a while. New scandals came. New outrage filled the timelines. But in certain circles, quiet ones, Sofia's name stayed. Not as a symbol, as a person, as someone who reminded people that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy. That sometimes, power is choosing not to become what hurt you. And Clarissa? She lived quietly now, in a smaller city where no one asked too many questions. Her house was still big, her closet still full, but her voice, once amplified by entitlement, had grown small. She'd walk into rooms and feel eyes, not applause. She'd see mop buckets and wonder if someone was filming. She'd pass a girl in uniform and look away. That was her penance. Not exile, not prison, just the knowledge that no one feared her anymore. And for people like her, that's the sharpest cut of all. Sophia never asked for revenge. What she got instead was something better. A room of her own, a future with her name on the door, and a world that, finally, had no choice but to look her in the eye. The city didn't erupt in applause. No parades, no medals, no grand finale under golden confetti. But things changed in the way real change always does, slowly, quietly, then all at once. Sophia began to notice it first in the little things. A stranger holding the door longer than needed. A bus driver who nodded when she stepped on. A vendor at the fruit stand who tossed an extra orange into her bag without saying a word. And at the library, where she still went every other Sunday afternoon, the librarian asked her what she thought they should order next for the children's section. Not because she was on some committee, just because her voice suddenly mattered. At first, she didn't know what to make of it. All her life, she had been background noise in someone else's story, the person who slipped in after hours to clean the mess others left behind. But now people stopped her in the market just to ask if she was the girl from the video, and when she said yes, they didn't pity her, they thanked her. For standing there, for not yelling back, for holding her head high while someone else tried to drag it into the dirt. She would smile politely, say thank you, and move on. But every time it happened, a strange warmth gathered in her chest, like light being poured into a place that had lived too long in shadow. Across the city, whispers grew louder, of other women, other men, other workers who started speaking up, not with anger but with a quiet kind of pride. A cook at a hotel who asked for better pay and didn't get fired. A janitor who was invited to speak at a school assembly. A teenage dishwasher who quit her job at a place where they mocked her accent and found work somewhere that called her by her name. Sophia didn't start a movement on purpose. She didn't have a mission statement or a slogan. All she had was her story, and somehow that was enough. It reached people not through hashtags, but through heartbeats. It didn't scream. It whispered. And in that whisper, others began to hear echoes of themselves. As for the center, the one Alejandro built and Sophia helped shape, it became more than a building. It became a seed. And from it grew programs, classes, jobs, second chances. The dorm upstairs stayed full, but never overcrowded, because every woman who stayed long enough eventually moved on with something new in her hands. A trade, a letter of recommendation, sometimes just the courage to keep going. On weekends, children would gather in the courtyard for storytelling hours, and Sophia would sometimes read aloud from the same book she used to keep folded under her pillow. The first time she did it, her hands trembled. But the girl in the front row, maybe 7 years old, with huge brown eyes and a scraped knee, looked up at her like she was a magician. And somehow, that steadied her. Alejandro never took credit. When asked by reporters what inspired the center, he simply said, "A lesson I should have learned long ago." But he stayed close, not as a patron, not as a figurehead, just as someone who understood the cost of silence. He and Sophia met often, not for business, but over coffee or long walks where they barely spoke at all. Their friendship wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was built on respect, and in this world, that's rarer than love. Clarissa Reyes was never charged with anything. No crime had been committed, technically, but her exile was social, not legal. Her name disappeared from foundation boards. Her company stocks dipped. She moved to another region, where her last name meant little, and kept mostly to herself. Once, someone spotted her in a corner cafe, sunglasses on indoors, stirring a cappuccino she didn't drink. When the server accidentally spilled a bit of water on her sleeve, she didn't yell. She didn't even speak. She just got up and left. Maybe she learned something. Maybe not. But the world had moved on. And this time, it moved forward without her at the center. Years passed. Sophia's name stopped trending. The headlines found new stories. But in the neighborhood where she once walked unnoticed, people still remembered. Not because she was famous, but because she reminded them that you don't have to be famous to change something. One afternoon, a reporter came by the center to do a retrospective. Whatever happened to the maid who stood still, they called it. Sophia agreed to the interview, but only if they didn't call her a maid in the headline. That's not my whole story, she said. The journalist blinked, then nodded, scribbling out the draft. They asked what she had learned through it all, what she would tell others, and she thought for a long time before answering. People will step on you, she said. Sometimes gently, sometimes so hard you forget how to stand. But your value doesn't come from who sees you. It comes from you knowing you're still standing, even when no one claps. The article went viral again, but this time, she didn't hide from it. She let her name sit there on the page. Sophia Valdez. A name no longer whispered behind brooms or beneath breath. A name spoken aloud. A name remembered. And in the soft golden light of another quiet morning, she walked past the bakery where she used to be invisible, and the baker handed her a conchus, warm, sweet, and wrapped in paper, with a grin. On the house, Miss Valdez, he said. She smiled, not out of pride, but out of peace, because the world may forget what you wore, how you spoke, even what you did, but it remembers how you made it feel. And Sophia? She made the world feel like maybe, just maybe, there's hope for dignity in silence, strength in stillness, and victory in walking forward, one steady step at a time. And maybe, in the end, that's all any of us are really looking for, not applause, not perfection, but to be seen for who we are, and to know that in the quiet moments, our light still matters. If this story moved you even a little, let it stay with you. Let it remind you that dignity doesn't shout. It endures. And that kindness is never wasted, even when no one's watching. Thank you for watching Cracks of Light. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, shared, and remembered, we invite you to like the video, leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more light to the cracks this world tries to hide. Until next time, stay human. Stay kind, stay strong.